Welcome CSE 235 class to ex12-RPS rock, paper, scissors. And we're going to have a lot to do on this. We're going to start off with the CSS on this part, and I'll also start off just downloading it and getting it set up. I'm going to be using Atom. So I'm going to go to My Warren and I'll go to Coursework. And this is ex12, and you'll find it under, I believe, Unit 11. But here's ex12 rock, paper, scissors. And just keep in mind too, if any of these close, you are able to click on the link in here and get to any files you need to download, even if you can't upload them. So I just want you to be aware of that if they do close sometimes, because I do have to put dates on them, and I'm not always real strict about the dates because I know for these kind of classes people upload things when they can. So just remember that if you need to get something or download something, you can do it even if it's closed. And if you need me to open it, just email me and ask me to open it. So anyway, back to ex12 rock, paper, scissors. I'm going to click on the link first, and then I'm going to go to the download file, and it's going to be called ex12-rps.zip. Sometimes I don't have anything after the ex12, but just so you know it's RPS, and just so you don't get it confused with any other exercises that you're working on, it's going to have the -RPS on there. So we're going to leave that on there. So I'm going to download it. You could click on it, or you can right click and save link as and save it to wherever you're keeping your files that you're working on. For now, I'm going to keep mine in my CSE 235, and I'm putting it in a folder called working folders because I have a couple of these ex12 folders floating around, so I don't want to mess up the original, and this is the one I'm going to work on, so I'm going to save it into here for now. That's where I'm going to work on the folder. And then on the Mac, I can just double click on it to kind of unzip it. And remember, on Windows you have a kind of a different process of doing that, unzipping it or decompressing it, which I've gone over before. And basically you want to make sure that you see the folder, and the zip you want to get rid of. You don't want the zip anymore because you're going to zip it when you're done. So I'm going to get rid of that now so I have the regular folder. And what's going to be in this folder is going to be an image. I think I said images, but it's IMG folder, and there's 4 images in there: blank, paper, rock, scissors. And there's also a ex12.css. That's a cascading style sheet file. If you're not familiar with it, that's what we're going to be working on now. Then there is the index.html file. That's going to have basically our visual content, and our JavaScript will go in there. So I'm not going to open these up yet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Atom, and you could go to brackets and do open folder, or I'm going to go to Atom right now. And here's Atom, and I do have one that's kind of a finished one, so that I had already worked on, and it is going to be a little different, but if I ever need to see anything, I'll kind of look at that. But this one I'm going to kind of start from scratch, so I'm going to do File, Add Project Folder, and I'm just going to go navigate to the one that I just downloaded, and it's in Working Folders, and here it is. So you just have to select the folder and hit Open, and it'll show up over there. So there's my IMG folder, there's my ex12.css, and here's my index. And remember, in here you could click on these things and look at the images that are in there. We've worked with these before. We'll close them up. And now the first thing we're going to be working on is the CSS file. Now what you're going to see in here, but all this stuff here, these say media queries for responsive breakpoints. What that means is when the page size gets smaller, there's some kind of adjustments that are made to make it fit in a device, like on a phone or iPad or anything like that. So these are responsive breakpoints. I'm not going to ask you to do those, but you're going to do everything before there. Well, actually, let me just show you the finished product again. I'm just going to open up a finished one, and I'm going to open it in browser, and I'm not going to go through everything because we already did that on the previous video, which you can do in Atom. If you were in brackets, you'd use that little preview thing with the little lightning bolt on it. And this is the finished version here, and one thing just I want to point out is that as you resize it, you can see it's kind of responsive. These are kind of far apart, then they get closer, then at some point they kind of stack. So that's kind of the responsiveness, and that's what those media queries will kind of do at the end, and I'll explain that later. But for now, everything is just going to center our page, and I'm going to try to keep it as generic as possible. I don't know if we'll change a whole bunch of colors and things like that, because we want to really focus on our JavaScript. So I don't know if we'll get into all the color kind of things, but we'll keep it as simple as we can from the beginning, and try to keep the code down as far as the amount of code that we're working on, especially in the CSS. So this is kind of what it looks like. And remember, if you submit name, it doesn't do anything. It just says human computer. If you put your name in here, if I put Rich in here and I hit submit name, it'll replace human with my name. Then you can start playing the game, and then whatever one you hit, this is yours over here, and then it has a random one over here, and then it keeps score, and then it does a 2 out of 3, and then you can reset. And it goes back to these blank images. So I went over that in the first video. So now we're going to start working on our code. And what we want to do first is we just want to make it look like this. So I guess I'll keep this open as we look at another one. But I'm going to go back to, this is my finished one. And I'm going to close this up. And I'm going to open up my index.html. I can double click to open it up. And I just want to point out some things, and the HTML will be done for you. So you don't have to do the HTML. All the IDs will be done for you, the labels will be done for you, the name. So you don't have to do all that, but you do need to be aware of all that, and you do need to know what things are called and what things are named and where things are at. So you will need to be familiar with all of that. And I did want to show up top just a couple things in here, and again, these will be in here already, but we just have the meta char set, but that's basically the universal kind of text that'll enable this to display in different languages if it needs to, but that's just something general we put in there. This meta name viewport, that kind of helps the scaling for responsive viewing. So on a phone and things like that, this viewport meta tag is something we need to put in there, and that's recommended to put in there. Well, I'm not going to get into explaining that right now. But this is very important. This is the link rel equals style sheet, type equals text, well, you could read it, but it's basically a link to our CSS file. It's an external link. That way we don't have to put all the styles inside this document, because we're already going to have enough in here. We're already going to have all our HTML and tags, and then we're going to have all our JavaScript in here. And keep in mind, our JavaScript can be in a separate file, but we're going to keep it all together for now. It just might be easier instead of jumping between 3 files. But we are going to separate our CSS, and that's what we're going to do first. And then once we're done with that, we could leave it alone. We don't have to do anything with our CSS. Then we could focus on our JavaScript and our HTML, because that's where we're going to be looking at IDs and trying to find where things kind of end up in this file. So that's what this is. That's what this link rel is, and it's in the head tag, and it links to an external style sheet so that once the file loads, once the index.html file loads, it'll look to that and it'll put things in their necessary styles. So that's what we're going to look at next. So I'm going to go to my ex12-CSS, and there's already something started here. And I didn't even mean to leave this in here, but it's in here for now, and that's okay. Open this up in a browser. So I'm gonna do a control open in browser, and I'm gonna open up this one. Okay, now this, I just have to make sure I'm not confused with this one. This is how it shows up right now, and you can see everything's just centered from now. From the way this one was, we are going to want to do this. We're going to want to put these side by side, and that's called floating using CSS properties. We actually have to float these side by side. But right now they're not. They're centered. And actually, it's not bad being centered. It just takes up a lot of vertical space. So, for most of it, we're going to try and keep them side by side. But this is what it's going to end up looking like when we're done. So, that is part of it. But we do want to float it initially so we can kind of use a little more of our page, and we don't have to scroll down to see things, because we don't need this much white space on either side. So we're going to have to float these, and we're going to use CSS, and that's just going to kind of put these two things in columns. Everything else will pretty much be centered. So that's what we're going to do next. So in our CSS, this text align center is what actually centered everything that we had just looked at. And unfortunately, we can't just leave everything like that, because when we float our images side by side, this text align center won't do it properly. Now there's different ways to do this, but I'm going to try to do it the easiest way. And what we're going to do, even though it may not make complete sense to you right now, what we are going to do with our body tag is we're going to put in 2 properties here. And again, the way these go, the way CSS goes, is there's the element or the target, and it could either be an HTML element, or it could be an ID, or it could be a class. But for right now, this is an HTML element. We're going to say everything in the body. We're going to text align everything centered that's in body. And then we're also going to add 2 more properties, and that's what we're going to do right now. I'm going to do one that's basically a width. And I'm going to say width, and I'll put a colon, and I'll do 65%. and I'll put a semicolon to end it. So that's the way these declarations happen in CSS. We have our target element, which is body, and then we have curly brackets, and then we could put one or more declarations in here for our CSS. So one of them is going to be width 65%. Now that's just the body. That's just all the content that's in the body tags. You may not see, it may not look any different by doing this. Now another thing we're also going to put in here, and this is something, it's kind of odd, but we're just going to put something that says margin auto, margin colon and then auto. And if it shows up here, I'll click on it. And you can have a space here in between here. So people like to sometimes have that division space. You don't have to, but it looks a little neater with the little space in there. Now what that does is it kind of centers the body element. So if you made the body 65%, it's going to always center that in the page no matter how big the window is. Not just the content in there, but the whole body element. And again, what that'll do is it'll help center, it'll help center these things, you know, right here. It'll keep these things side by side and keep them centered on a page. So that's why we have that in there. There's different ways to do that, but the other alternatives are just as kind of confusing. So I think this is the easiest way to do that. So just trust me for this one that we're going to do this. We're going to basically give the body a width of 65%. And you're not going to know how wide the body is because it's not going to be a different color than the background or anything. So it's all going to be just white background. Margin auto just kind of centers it, centers the body element. It puts an even amount. It puts an automatic amount of margin on either side is actually what it does, what margin auto does. So it gives the impression of centering by putting auto margin on either side. And then text align centers any kind of text elements inside there. So that's the first part that we're going to do on body. So we put in that first kind of element there for body. Another thing I'm going to do is I look at these elements, these submit names, and even Css rock paper. The buttons are kind of small. And even this little thing that we fill in here, if I fill in my name here, which I can't fill, it's really tiny. So I'm going to make the font size a little bigger. And their font size is a little, it's not based on the typical 16 pixel kind of default. So we are going to have to make that a little bit different. And we could just kind of experiment by putting in 1em. Now 1em would make it like 16 pixels if we put that in. And we might have to make it a little bit smaller, but let's just try it out. So what we're going to target is we're going to target the button element, and we can also target the input element. These are button elements. We're going to target all of those the same way we targeted body. So let me just go back to our CSS, and we're working on our ex12 CSS, and we're going to make a new target element, and I'm going to put input, then I'm going to put a comma, and I'm going to put button because we have button elements. So when you do two, you could target two elements by putting a comma. And I'll put my curly bracket and hit return. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put font size, and I'm going to just put 1em for now. 1em should make it like the default 16 pixels of web pages. So I'm just going to save that, and I should be able to just keep going back here and refreshing. So let me see what that looks like. And you can see that makes it quite a bit bigger, maybe even a little too big. So that's why you can actually take this down a little bit. So if you don't want it quite 1em, you don't want your buttons that big, although that's not too bad. You could do it like 0.9 or 0.95 or something like that. So maybe I'll go down here and put it like 0.95. I'll just make it a little bit smaller. I'll save it. I'll go back here. I'll refresh it. Now it's a little smaller, but that's good. So those are nice button sizes. And if I put my text in here, I'll just put my name in here. That's a decent size. I could read that. Okay, so that's what I did there. So I put an element for my buttons and my input. This is input text, this is button, and the rest are buttons, and just adjusted the font size. So I could put other things in there, but that's fine for now. Okay, the next thing that I want to do is I want to float these things. Let me go on my index. I want to float, and these are labeled by divs. They're IDs, but they're called divs. And you know, they could be paragraphs, they could be anything else, but they're divs. Divs are just sections or divisions of an HTML page. So they're block elements, so they act like a paragraph, so you can't necessarily put them side by side unless you do something special like floating, which is exactly what we're going to have to do here. But we have two divs here, and they stack on top of each other by default, and we're going to try to put them side by side. So there's a div ID called my choice, and a div ID called computer choice. Those are the two images with the labels on top and the labels below, the names above, and then there's just the images that are below it, the names of the images like rock, paper, scissors. So my choice is the ID name and comp choice is the other ID name. And what I'm going to do here is make two separate declarations, or two separate kind of styles for these. So I'll go back to my CSS and I'll just remember it's my choice and comp choice. And I'm using camel case with the capital C, and it starts lowercase and then it has a capital C in the middle for both of these. So I'll go with my choice first. Now this is not an HTML element, so you can see it's not showing up in blue or an underline, but what I do want to do is put a pound sign in front of it because that indicates that it's an ID. I don't need that when I give it an ID name. I just have to put quotes around it and call it an ID. CSS needs to recognize IDs by this pound sign. So that's my choice. And I'm just going to do this first, and then I'll copy it and just change the name. So because they're going to have some of the same things here. And what I'm going to put in here is something called float, and it's going to be left. And that basically removes it from HTML flow and kind of just moves it to the left of everything else. So that's all I'm going to do first, and then I'm going to copy my choice and I'll paste it, and this one's going to be comp choice. And instead of a float, I could leave it float left, but I'm going to do it a float right because then it'll kind of push to the other side of the page when they're further apart. And so that also removes it from HTML and makes it float to the right. So I'm just going to save that and we'll see what it looks like so far. And I'll refresh it, and you see what happens, except all this other stuff moves up inside it, and it kind of squeezes. Eventually it gets pushed down, but it kind of gets squeezes in between there. It's because this float, when you do a float, it removes it from HTML flow. This one moves to the left, that moves to the right, and if there's room in the middle, this stuff just kind of moves up there, and we don't want it to be up there. So what we're going to do is we're going to clear the float after that, so that these aren't a part of that. So we're going to do something and we're going to have to see which one that is. So I'm going to go back to my index and scroll down, and I'm looking for where it says it's the next thing after these two things. The next thing after is the H2. So I'm going to target the H2 and just tell it to clear float. So that means after these two things are done floating, I could clear it and say no more floating, and then they'll just become another block element underneath that. So I'm going to go back here and I'm just going to put in an H2. And that'll show blue because that's an HTML element. And I'll do something called clear. And we could do both. That'll clear the left and the right. So do clear both in there. And I'll save that, and I'll see what's happening here. And now that kind of moves it. So that's kind of what we want. Let's see what this looks like so far. And I think that's pretty good. I think that's pretty much what we want so far. So I think that's all we need. These elements are centered there, so everything looks okay. As far as our layout goes, everything's pretty much centered. Everything's kind of, and you can see our responsiveness kind of takes effect here. And let me just point that out real quick before we finish this up, is that there's breakpoints here, and they basically say once it gets to 600 pixels, then what we're going to do is we're going to just kind of change the width of the body a little bit. Instead of being 65%, we're going to widen it out so that things go to the edge a little bit, and then we put a little margin on it. And then what's eventually going to happen once we get down to 430 pixels, we're going to remove the float so they stack. And these other things are just kind of just little spacing things, so don't worry too much about them. I mean, you can look at them, but don't worry too much about them. And I'll just kind of point this out that, you know, here's once we get down to 600 pixels, which is probably going to be right about here, you can see what happens. It kind of becomes, the whole body becomes 92% instead of 65, because up here it's 65, but then it'll get too small at some point. So once it gets to here, once those human and computer get pushed together, we kind of stretch them out a little bit and then allow body to have kind of the whole browser window here up to a certain point, and then once they get close again at about 430 pixels, then we decide to stack them, because we figure this is basically the way it would look like maybe on a phone if you're holding like a phone vertically. So that's where these kind of breakpoints come out, and they're a little tricky to do because phones are changing and breakpoint sizes are changing, so there's no real way to do that. And that I have some videos on responsive, because we could use Firefox has like a responsive preview that you can kind of that helps you kind of mark where those breakpoints are at. But anyway, this is the setup right now, and there's some things we're not seeing yet. We're going to see a little label show up under here, and we're going to see information show up here when it's keeping track of our score and all that. So that's what's going to happen next, but that's basically our CSS. So make sure you save your CSS, make sure it looks like this, make sure it starts out looking like this, and make sure you get your floats. I mean, there's not a lot of CSS. Since this stuff is done, there's just kind of 3 declarations for body, and you can clean it up a little. There's 3 declarations for body: text align center, margin auto, width 65, button, and wait, I'm looking at the wrong one here. This one is even shorter, but same thing. Body, it has a width of 65%, margin of auto, text align center, input and button with a comma, so that targets both of them. They have a font size of 0.95. You could leave it at 1em or 0.9 or 0.95, whatever you want. And then we're targeting the 2 IDs here. We're just saying float left, float right. And on the previous one, just to show you, this is my finished one, I had text align center on these, and I had the input and button ones separate, but I was able to put them together with a comma. And I don't need text align center because the text align center in the body covers these things, so they're already centered. So the code that we have in the one I'm working on right now is actually even cleaner. So there's less things going on here. And then once we're done with floating, the next element after those 2 floating elements, we just say clear both, so that that's not affected. So that just becomes a block. It doesn't like slip in between those things. It becomes another block element that just kind of isn't really affected by the float. So that's our CSS. So we're done with our CSS. You could save it, and you probably don't have to do anything else with your CSS after doing that. So that's your CSS, and we're going to start with our JavaScript next.